Spring is right around the corner, which means it's time to get outside and enjoy some fresh air. When most people think of Jeep, they picture the great outdoors, trails, maybe spotting some wildlife. They don't think of this. Meet the most insane Jeep ever produced, the Grand Cherokee Trackhawk. You can tell the company is run by enthusiasts when somebody gets the idea to put the 707 horsepower engine from the Dodge Challenger and Charger Hellcat in the Grand Cherokee. The crazier thing is they've actually done it. The same 6.2-liter supercharged V8 can now be had in a vehicle that carries 5 people comfortably and has plenty of cargo space. I know in the past Jeep has made the SRT as an extreme performance version, and they still do in 2018. But the Trackhawk is in another league. In fact, it has 232 more horsepower than the current SRT model. After spending a couple of days with the Trackhawk, I noticed most people really weren't sure what it was. Now, in my opinion, that's a good thing, because you can seriously embarrass a lot of sports cars with this. The easiest way to spot one on the road is by noticing the yellow brake calipers. Only the Trackhawk has them. They're red on the SRT models. Now you might be thinking, well, that's great, Phil, but just how quick is it? Well, Jeep claims a 0 to 60 time of just 3.5 seconds and a quarter-mile time of 11.6 seconds. Honestly, some people have clocked it even faster on that 0 to 60 time. Performance figures are great, but what is it really like to live with on a day-to-day basis? Over the last decade or so, I haven't really spent a lot of time thinking about Jeep Grand Cherokees, to be really honest with you, and that's really because there's been so many new SUVs being added to the market all of the time. Now, back in the 90s and certainly the early 2000s, most people that wanted an SUV for their family chose a Jeep Grand Cherokee. So since that time, they have continued to expand their lineup and add more and more models for a variety of different customers. There are ones that are more off-road capable. There's ones that are more luxurious. There's ones that are just a little more bare bones, just if you don't want to have a ton of luxury features or you're trying to save a little bit more money. Then a few years back, they added the SRT model, which added quite a bit more horsepower and added a performance version. But since then, now we're up to 2018, and we have this vehicle, the Trackhawk, not to be confused with the Trailhawk, which is the extreme off-road version. The Trackhawk is the car we're sitting in here, and the basic gist of this is they've put the 707 horsepower engine from the Dodge Challenger and Charger Hellcats into this car. So, you know, this kind of makes me think back to the time when they put the Viper engine in the Dodge Ram and did that SRT10 version, and it was really cool because anybody who had one of those, you really had to be a car enthusiast to know that that's what that car was. And you'd see it at a car show or something, and somebody'd pop the hood and it said Viper on it. It looked exactly, and it was exactly the same engine that you would see in the Viper. But what's so crazy about this car is this car actually has more horsepower than most Vipers ever produced in the entire run since back in 1992. In fact, the original Viper only had 400 horsepower, and this basically family car, this SUV, has 700 horsepower, which is just, it's really just a wild idea. I think the whole deal with this car that you have to keep in mind is performance SUVs have really started to take off. The market for performance SUVs is totally there. And, you know, Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep is kind of sitting here and they're thinking to themselves, well, you know, we have some of the most powerful engines, some of the highest horsepower engines available on the market anywhere with the Challenger, Hellcat, even with the SRT models, is still producing 475 horsepower in the Grand Cherokee version. It's still quite a bit of horsepower for an SUV. But as you look at this market and you look at something that is in this performance category, maybe not horsepower-wise, but certainly in that 0 to 60 time of 3.5 seconds, which is how fast this car is, there's still really not a lot of competition. This car retails for right in between about $85,000 and $100,000, depending on the amount of options that you want. You know, there's a couple of colors that cost more. There's some different options as far as wheels and tires. The panoramic sunroof is an option. Other than that, there's really not a ton of features. This does come standard with things like navigation. You know, it's got park sensors, it's got lane departure warning, blind spot monitoring, you've got adaptive cruise control, all of those kind of things. You've got a great digital display here in the middle of this dash, which really looks nice and really gives you more information than you could ever possibly want to know about the vehicle. This is a very, very quick car. But surprisingly enough, it's pretty easy to drive around town. When you first read the specs and you hear all this, you think, 700 horsepower in a Jeep Grand Cherokee, how is that even drivable on the street? Well, thanks to computer technology and modern technology, the car has a lot of different drive modes. There's just what they call auto mode, which can kind of sense that the traction, kind of sensing your inputs. I wouldn't call it comfort mode, but it definitely kind of softens things up a little bit and makes it easier to drive. Not only with the throttle response, you have to push a little bit farther into the accelerator pedal to make things happen, but it also softens the suspension a little bit as well. If you want, put it in sport mode, you'll firm up the suspension, you can tell it immediately. That's another thing I'll say about this car that I really like, is these different modes really do give you a different feeling behind the wheel. There's not a lot of cars that do that. Plenty of cars have sport mode or track mode or whatever, but sometimes you can go through the dial and drive it around and go, I really can't tell a big difference. This car, the throttle response changes immediately whenever you put it into sport mode, and track mode is just another level altogether. In fact, it really is made for the track. You know, there's other cars, you put it in track mode on the street, well, that's okay. But this car, it really, everything just seems very raw and just very rough. Something else that this car has is launch control, which is somewhat rare in the SUV market, but what's really cool is there's this button down here that says launch, and it has this Christmas tree that just like at the drag strip, and they actually have that on the SRT model as well. That's kind of a little bit of an overview of this car. I want to drive it now and let you hear the exhaust and also let you hear the supercharger whine, and we'll show you a little bit of the difference between the auto and the sport mode. So let me fire this up. You can hear that almost immediately that it has quite a bit of sound in the back, especially if you're outside of the car. It has a nice rumble to it and makes a really good sound as far as that goes. The thing about it is, they say this exhaust has been kind of softened down or tuned down a little bit for this application as opposed to the Charger and the Challenger. But I still think it sounds wonderful. And the supercharger whine, especially in sport mode, that comes on almost immediately. As soon as you're behind the wheel, especially in this auto mode, I really think it's a pretty easy car to drive. You can definitely tell that it's got plenty of power. It certainly has a beefy feel to it. I love the steering wheel, a nice fat steering wheel. You've got nice areas here for your thumb rests up and down. You've got the paddle shifters. These are not my favorite paddle shifters. I'm never really a fan of the ones that are attached to the wheel. I like for them to be separate from the wheel, but they do the job just fine. And this car shifts incredibly quick. It's sort of a toy, but it's sort of not, because you really can take 4 adults in here very comfortably. The rear seat passengers have things like heated seats. They've got their own USB plug-ins back there. They've got their own air vents. So you still get that luxury aspect that you've come to expect from a Jeep Grand Cherokee, being Jeep's top-of-the-line model. These combination leather and suede seats are very comfortable. So you still get a lot of those features. This has air-conditioned seats, or the cooled seats as well. You're still getting a lot of that. You're not compromising in that area. In fact, these seats are incredibly comfortable. I've not at any point felt like they were not something that you could sit in for hours and hours. Now that we've got it in sport mode, it's definitely on this road, which is a little bit more of a rough road. You can definitely feel every little bump in the road. Honestly, the sport suspension being firmed up. You can tell that the handling feels a little bit sharper because it is stiffer. The steering feel is a little bit stiffer as well. And the throttle response, really, as you can hear that sound, you can really get into it a lot quicker. The supercharger as well. You can hear that nice whine from under the hood. There's so much drama to this car. There's just so much to experience with it, because you get all these different sounds coming from the front and the back. You get pushback in your seat when you go near the gas pedal. So much is involved with driving this car, and you really just feel like you just need to hold on at some points. I'll slow down here a little bit and give it some juice, and you can kind of hear what it sounds like. Yeah, so that was a few miles an hour, let's say, and it's just, it pushes your head back, it makes such a great sound, it has that nice bark from the exhaust, and things are happening very, very quickly. It just kind of, it's like going into hyperspace mode or something. It's just, and it changes the way that you feel about these type of cars too, because it's an SUV. Got it in auto mode, and I like this here on the dash. You can kind of hear it a little bit as you start to lay into the gas. It takes a little bit more to get a response out of this car unless it's in sport mode, and I think that's really a good thing, because most of the time you're going to be driving this in traffic, you're going to be driving it around town. It's only until you get outside of town on some of these other roads before you're really going to be able to open it up. And even then, there's not a ton of places where you really can just open up 700 horsepower. And that's really okay. I think this car is just such a fun car, such a neat idea. There's not really any point to it. Nobody needs a car like this. It's not for off-roading. You are losing some of the off-road ability, mostly because of these tires. One of the things I read, there's a disclaimer in here that says these tires really should not be used if the temperature outside's below 40 degrees. You're not supposed to use them in snow and ice, that kind of thing, which is basically like any high-performance tire. But it just seems kind of strange when you think about it when you're talking about an SUV. One of the things that really surprised me about this car is how good the handling is. You know, this seems like a car that you'd want to take to the drag strip and, you know, show off to some people that wouldn't maybe know what it is or wouldn't think that it would have as much power as it does. But even when we're out here on these twisty country roads, it really handles quite well, not only for being such a tall car, but just the fact that it has all this power, but it goes around these corners really well, and the upgraded suspension and everything really helps with that. And I like the fact that Jeep did that. You know, it doesn't need to just be something that can go fast in a straight line. It also needs to handle well too, so that you get more of a sporty experience all of the time, and it's not something that you're just going to stomp on it at a stoplight or something. And make no mistake, this is a heavy car. It doesn't, you know, it doesn't handle like a Porsche Boxster or something, but it definitely handles well as SUVs go, especially one with this much power. You just have to be a little more cautious than you would with an SUV that's got maybe 300 or 400 horsepower, because when you come out of these turns, if you get too crazy with it, it can get a little squirrely on you. Even with the stability and traction control on, it just has so much power that coming out of these corners, you'll be at the next corner before you know what happened if you're not careful. So it takes a little bit of getting used to. It's not a car that you can really just hop in and drive if you haven't driven a lot of high-performance vehicles, whether that be an SUV or not. These brakes are exceptional as well, and they really need to be, not only with this much power, but with this much weight. But these humongous Brembo brakes that are bigger really than a dinner plate that the rotors are, they're just humongous. It has a nice sporty feel to the brake pedal too. So overall, this really doesn't feel much like a Jeep Grand Cherokee as you're going back and forth between the accelerator and the brake, because everything has just been beefed up so much that it doesn't really feel like a traditional Grand Cherokee at all. It also feels very planted on the road, these nice wide tires and just the wide stance of it. It's got a great feel to it. One thing that's neat on this car, you got a lot of really cool graphics. There's, in the background here on the Uconnect screen, is what looks like the striped corner of a racetrack. It just makes such a great sound, and it's so much fun. You just can't help but want to give it some juice. Another thing I want to talk about is these performance pages, which is the thing that they have on the Hellcat models as well, but they've added it here. And in addition to all the different drive modes and the different things that you can select, you can go in here and find out about exactly how much horsepower that you're using at the time, your boost pressure, what gear you're in, the steering angle, G-force. You can do a 0 to 60 times, 0 to 100, quarter mile, eighth of a mile. There's a whole bunch of different things that you can do in here. There's even a dyno where you can see it's very, very involved. It's also really cool because you can plug in a USB drive and screenshot what you're doing on here to save it, so you can, you know, keep track of your 0 to 60 times or your quarter mile times. So, the Jeep Grand Cherokee Trackhawk is quick, expensive, and gets terrible gas mileage, 11 in town to be exact. At times, the ride is a little rough, and it's always firm no matter what setting you put it in. But to focus on these things is missing the point. When you compare the numbers across the entire SUV market, you'll find $90,000 for this level of performance to be a total bargain. It's quicker than a BMW X5 and X6M. It's quicker than the new Cayenne Turbo and the Range Rover Sport SVR, each of these costing $10,000 to $30,000 more depending on options. To match that 0 to 60 time of 3.5 seconds, you'd have to order a W12 cylinder version of the Bentley Bentayga or the new Lamborghini Urus, and you're looking at basically $200,000 plus for each of those. The Trackhawk gives muscle car fans who don't want to get away from purchasing an SUV a really neat alternative. The sounds are loud and the power comes on really strong no matter what. In addition to that, the handling is actually much better than it needs to be. Overall, it's not a car for the faint of heart, which makes it all the more exciting. Another selling point, your kids will never be late for school again. Thanks for watching this edition of Phil's Morning Drive. We'll see you next time.